Yay! I am so hoping this works because Live was being a little difficult this morning, but I think we're doing it now. So yay! Um,
Woo!
Woohoo! So welcome everyone. And it's Amanda Testa here. And today I'm going to be talking with the beautiful Rachel Halder. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today because we've got some good stuff to talk about. Rachel actually she has just gotten her MA in religion with concentrations in sexual ethics and embodied spirituality. So she is a perfect person to talk to today about sex and shame and religion. And I would love to start with Rachel, just please introduce yourself.
Yeah, well, you did a pretty good job. Yeah, my name is Rachel, and just graduated, and my thesis work was really on the suppression of sexuality in the Christian church, and looking at it as a form of spiritual trauma. So obviously, there's sexual trauma that can happen, there's sexual abuse that can happen, but I believe there's actually like spiritual sexual abuse that can happen and spiritual trauma. So the whole premise of my thesis was based on the idea that when one suppresses their sexuality or learns a lot of dogma, or beliefs around sexuality that is kind of surrounded in shame and fear and judgment and these like life degenerating emotions, that it actually cuts them off from their life force, because our sexuality is, what gives life to the world. And then it cuts, therefore, off their life force from themselves, first and foremost, but then from others, from spirit, from God, from nature, from universe, from all other entities around them, and therefore form of spiritual trauma. So that was sort of what like my thesis was about. I guess about me, I live in New Mexico and I live on a mountain, really super off the grid, composting toilets. Yeah, like all my water is from a fresh spring. It's really kind of amazing. And yeah, I love all things sacred and I love all things sexy.
Yeah, I love that. So I love Taos. Actually, my husband took me on a surprise trip there when we were dating, which was so fun. And
Oh,
we stayed in the Earth ships.
yeah, nice. Yep. Yeah, Taos is gorgeous. It's an amazing, amazing area. I'm kind of north, about 20 miles north of Taos.
Beautiful. So let me ask you, what kind of led you on this path to study sexuality?
Yeah, well, it's been an interest of mine for a long time. Like it was definitely an evolution of self. My undergraduate degrees were in communication and women's studies, or now they switched it to gender studies, and it really was more gender studies, but the degree title is women's studies. And at that time in my life, I was really seeking out another form of spirituality because I grew up Mennonite, I grew up Christian. I grew up definitely in a bubble, and even the college I went to was a Mennonite college. So I grew up in this sort of like spiritual bubble, and I always felt like I've just always been a very spiritual child, but not in the kind of like way that was presented to me of like what spirituality was. And I was very confused, especially in college, about my identity. And I kind of went through like an agnostic slash atheist stage, but then it felt very like life depleting to me. It didn't feel good to me. It didn't feel right. And so I was talking to one of the women's studies about this, and she recommended that I do an independent study on the feminine divine. And so I started researching goddesses and the feminine divine, both in Christian traditions, but other like ancient traditions, and like had this whole, explosion into that aspect of my spiritual expression. Then right after graduating college, I moved to Indonesia, and living there, I had the re-memory of being abused as a 3-year-old, having a sexual assault happen. And that kind of like propelled me on this deep healing journey, and also a deep spiritual like awakening, and like really rooting into who I am, and like what I am, and how I present myself in the world, and really recognizing that my entire life had been based on this event that happened to me when I was 3 that I was completely unconscious to. And so I realized like how much of my life I was not living it all for me. I was living it for other people, and I was living it in response to this event that happened to me. And then as I developed, I started realizing like, oh wait, my first relationship when I was 15 with a 19-year-old was also very sexually abusive. And I just kept kind of realizing all these things. So I did a ton of work in sexual abuse advocacy. I had my own blog called Our Stories Untold, and I worked for this organization called Women Under Siege, which documents sexualized violence in conflict zones. And I did that work, and I was super passionate about it, but I kind of hit a wall eventually. And I felt like this work is important and valuable, but there's got to be more. Like I'm tired of being like the victim. I'm tired of the whole like victim perpetrator narrative. And I really, really, really want to find healing. Like, just like, I felt like I was at this like baseline of okay. Like it was sort of like, okay, like I feel fine. I can talk about my trauma. I can like, be in the world. I can do things. I'm like an active, I didn't feel like I was just super traumatized and like suffering from PTSD all the time. But I was like, what the heck? There's got to be more. Like there has to be more. So then that propelled me into this healing journey and the work that I did in grad school.
Beautiful. Well, I think it's amazing how you mentioned so much, and I loved in your thesis, you talked a lot about this, like how much goes on subconsciously with us that we're not even aware of that can really affect our lives and our sexuality. And I don't know if you would be open to speaking to that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, a big component of my thesis. So it kind of was the intersection of neuroscience, trauma healing, sexuality, and religion, I guess you could say, and embodied spirituality. So how you can use spiritual practices to shift yourself. So within like the neuroscience world, it's seen that basically like 80% of what goes on inside of ourselves, and that might not be like perfect 80% because different neuroscientists say different things, but basically 80% of what's going on is like we're unconscious to it. Like it's just happening. And so for example, like if I'm in a situation and it triggers my primal brain's memory of an experience that happened once before, I'm going to be interpreting everything that person's saying to me through that lens. That doesn't mean that that lens is actually the right lens or the correct lens, but it's the lens that I'm understanding and I'm seeing the situation through. And therefore I react to that person. I contribute to the conversation from that perspective, whether it's really what that person was saying to me or not. So in terms of our sexuality, we learn all of these different things about sexuality that we are completely unconscious to, like magazines, TV, like comments, maybe our uncle, like just a weird, like uncomfortable comment our uncle made to us when we were 6, maybe the boys on the bus who like asked to see your boobs. Like there's all these like little tiny events that happen and experiences that happen that we don't remember, but our body and our body mind are responding to everything that's happening in our present day reality based on this like massive catalog of past experiences. So when it comes to our sexuality, even if we don't feel like we've experienced trauma, like, oh, well, I've talked to a lot of women who are like, I've never been sexually abused, but I feel so shut down. Like I feel so much fear. I feel pain. I feel numbness. Like I just don't get it. It's almost like I feel like I'm sexually abused, but I don't want to say that because I haven't been sexually abused. It's like this confusing thing. And I always say, well, you don't have to be sexually abused to experience trauma. Like all of those cataloged experiences can create a response in your body that is trauma, like it's responding in that way. So it's an interesting thing because I think a lot of people don't recognize that or realize that, they think they have to have like one memory or one experience, or that they're much more aware of what they're doing than what we really are. I see myself all the time reacting to things my partner says, and I'm like, whoa, this is obviously coming from like not present day, something way deeper.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a powerful thing to look into because so many of us don't realize like how much culturally is ingrained in us that can really hold us back from feeling really fulfilled sexually. And
Yeah.
I would love if you would talk on that a bit too, because one of the things I find so interesting is how, you talk about this too, is like with the Puritan culture has really hurt people, like you mentioned earlier, like having this kind of trauma that is a spiritual trauma, but also affects your whole body. And I think too, I grew up very conservatively in a Southern Baptist. And I remember in 8th grade, one of my Sunday school teachers told us that we would go to hell if we held hands with a boy.
Oh,
So
wow.
those
Yeah.
kind of things, while they seem, maybe they're coming from a good place when they teaching these kind of things, but it can really be a long-term thing that suppresses you. And then you always feel guilty or shame around sex. And especially when they're teaching like, oh, abstain. And then when it's save it for marriage. And then when you get married, you're supposed to like know how to be the sex goddess, but you've never even been taught anything about the actual act of sex. So,
Exactly.
yeah. So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear too, in your studies, what you kind of learned about that and how that really does affect us.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I mean you really like hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. There's sort of like this false perception, especially in purity culture. I was really looking at purity culture. This idea that you shouldn't have sex before you're married, like even like you should kiss before you're married, like you really need to save yourself for one person. It's like you have purity rings, there's purity balls where like there's father-daughter dances where you like pledge to like basically like be your fathers until you're given away to another man, which I have a lot of things that that rubs me the wrong way on many different levels. But yeah, so there's this like whole idea or notion that like purity culture existed as a way to try to, I think, actually literally suppress people's sexuality. But it was because they're trying to like keep people safe. Like they're trying to create connection. They're trying to prevent like the shame and the judgment and the blame. Like I recognize that that's what purity culture is trying to do, is trying to like keep them pure. It really like provide a holistic space for a person to enter into their sexuality. But unfortunately, much of the languaging around it creates a culture of fear and a culture of shame. And so instead of feeling like, oh, like I don't want to just jump into a sexual situation because I actually don't know what my boundaries are, or because this person isn't valuing my sexuality, or because this person obviously doesn't know how to like please a woman, instead of like not entering sexuality like or sexual situations because of like concrete like valuable reasons. It's all about like you shouldn't do it because you're gonna go to hell and you're gonna be slut shamed and victim blamed, and like your life is gonna basically suck from that point forward. And this was very much what I experienced as a 15-year-old, and there's parts of the story and I don't have to go deeply into that, but it was the fact that I was in this relationship with a 19-year-old that was abusive, but instead of it being spoken about that it was an abusive relationship, instead what I received was like, this is your responsibility keeping him pure, like this is your duty to make sure he doesn't have sex with you, instead of being like, wait, why the heck is a 19-year-old having sex with a 15-year-old in the first place, so there's just these like backwards notions and concepts of like what a person should do. So basically what happens is when you're surrounded in this kind of culture and when you're hearing these things over and over again, and so for me, like after I did have sex, I never had sex again until I was 20 years old because I was so ashamed of that experience. And I didn't even consciously realize it was even abusive until I was 24, 25 years old. And when I would tell like Christian friends that I had sex, it was instantly like you're damaged goods. It was like the worst thing they could hear. It was like basically like I was telling them I murdered someone, and I super internalized that. And so for me, my sexual journey, and everyone experiences this differently. Like that's very key to point out as well. Everyone interprets it and their body responds in different ways. But for me on that personal journey, it was then like I just always held on to this idea that like my sexuality was very shameful. It was very bad. It was very negative, and it led to these very negative circumstances. And it basically led to me like not feeling safe, not belonging to my tribe, my community, and like not feeling loved. And so that since that was my learned, the like doctrine that I learned what sexuality was all about within, that meant into my adult life, that's what I carried with me. And so even though consciously I didn't realize any of this until like 2 years ago when I started actually working on this and working on my thesis,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't consciously recognize it, but I was basically still living my life based on those interpretations of doctrine and dogma that I learned when I was 15, based on purity culture's notion of sexuality.
Yeah.
Does that answer that
That
question?
does. That does. And
I was like, wait. that question was.
Yeah, no, that it does. And one of the other things I think it's interesting to point out is, you mentioned kind of you had a lot of issues around the Puritan culture for many reasons about, how women really are suppressed and
Mhm.
how this happens a lot. And I don't think many people realize, even, BC that, women, where people worshiped goddesses and, the,
Right.
the pussy was worshipped. Um,
Mhm.
and I would love if you would speak to that a little bit too, because, and this was funny. My husband's like, I really think that's so fascinating. And like, when did that change and why? That's a very long
Right.
story, but just to
Yeah.
briefly touch on that, if you would.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mentioned that in my my thesis. I sort of like began with that, and I talked about how the female body and sexual intimacy began as sacred, and there are even like sacred prostitutes, like temple priestesses who would basically like have sex with people, and they would just be like this complete like open vessel like of just love and compassion and beauty, and it was considered like this very sacred and divine act that they would do with people,
Mm.
and help them feel just totally loved, totally accepted in all of whatever they are. And yeah, so there's also like Rosemary Radford Ruther is this really, really badass feminist theologian. I actually took a class from her in grad school. I was just fortunate to do it, but she was like the first feminist theologian. And she talked about how like archaeological evidence also concludes that like the most ancient human image of the divine was female. And so in rocks and in all these different like, you know, what are those papyrus rolls, or there's all these images of the feminine form being divine. And when Christianity came along, I mean, it was like before Jesus, so it was before Christianity. It was really like the Hebrews developed monotheism, and they started developing the idea of one God, of a patriarchal God. And this, as it evolved alongside goddess religions and sacred priestesses. And so if you look at the Hebrew Bible, you can see evidence of this. It's like talked about in different verses in different sections of the Bible. But basically, slowly the Hebrew people started deeming like these divine sexual unions and these sacred priestesses as sinful, and that they were doing inappropriate practices, and that they were basically committing abominations. And so slowly like the goddess culture started getting eroded, and they kind of went underground. Like it had to be more practiced in secrecy, and I believe it's because of the whole like patriarchal one God notion. It really was kind of this idea to control. They wanted their spirituality, their religion to spread, and how better can you spread something than to control and deem something else as wrong and as inappropriate and as sinful. But these kind of strains still sort of have always existed, just more underground. But at one time, like, yeah, the prominent religion and the prominent spirituality was very much centered on the feminine form and on goddess worship.
Yeah. So to go back to the shame piece a little bit and how, we have these subconscious parts of us that are really running the show that we don't even realize half the time. And this is one of the things I really love about the work we're doing is learning more how to access those. And what would be your favorite tool that you have used? I'm sure there's many, but to really kind of help with the shame piece.
Yeah. Tool is definitely ridiculously difficult.
Or just maybe something that's really helped
Yeah.
kind of help
Can
you
I say
overcome
two
that.
things?
Of course you
Can I say
can.
two things?
Yeah,
Okay.
say two.
So, so one would be the jade egg is the tool that helped me the most with my trauma healing. So that the jade egg was the very first tool I ever used. I took Layla Martin's jade pleasure course about 2 years ago, and that was just so profound. Like, I honestly haven't quite experienced anything that like amazing or like kind of life shifting or life transforming since then. And a lot of it was doing the releasing and just like not, it was, I think it was so powerful because I didn't realize how much trauma I still had stored in my body. I kind of naively like thought that I had dealt with it because I'd been to therapy and like therapists had told me like, you don't really need therapy. Like, you're very emotionally intelligent. Like, you can handle this. Like, I don't really know why you're in this office. And I was in that office because I felt like sexually blocked. And I was like, I don't want to have sex with anyone. But like, they were kind of like, yeah, you're fine. And so doing the jade egg is just like gave this massive release to all this stored trauma that I had no idea was even in there. And I like cried like I never cried before. I shook like I never shook before. And it really was like the first thing that got me in touch with my body and my body mind and like all these pieces that have all this energy stored in them that I was so unconscious to. Again, like had no clue, like didn't even wasn't aware of it at all. A specific tool, like a specific practice that really released a lot of my sexual shame. It was a practice, I forget the title of it. It was created by Layla Martin. And it was in a week that really dealt with the shadow and dealt with, like shadow parts of ourselves. And it was a practice, it might've been the throne of your heart, but I'm not 100% sure, where you're self-pleasuring, and as you're self-pleasuring there's a recording, and she asks what is keeping you from like being fully in your full pleasure, what is keeping you from experiencing like full ecstasy, or she's just saying these different things. And then while you're self-pleasuring, you look inside and you feel into your body parts, like what is keeping me from that, and or a story, or a person or whatever. And this practice, I actually ended up doing it for like an hour and a half, even though it was a half-hour practice, because in the last 25 minutes, when I asked myself what it was that was keeping me from that, Jesus came in and was like present in the room. And it wasn't just like I was imagining Jesus, like it really was like a crazy supernatural, like, holy shit, Jesus is in this room right now. And then like all my dead ancestors started coming in, and I remembered how when I was a child, I was always like, I had a lot of deaths happen basically between age 7 and 9. Like all 4 of my grandparents died and my aunt died of breast cancer. And so like I was very, very in touch with death and grieving at a very young age. But like the biggest thing from that experience was like, I was really embarrassed to self-pleasure because I was convinced that my dead ancestors were watching me and were ashamed of me, and were judging me. And so as a kid, every time I would masturbate, I would have this like massive fear that they were there. And so all of my dead ancestors came into the room, and Jesus and my dead ancestors were really celebrating me and like encouraging me and being like, this work you're doing is amazing. Like it needs to happen in the world. Like we're guiding you. Like we're a part of you. Like we support this, like please don't feel shame, like on our account, and like just like really talking to me and pumping me up. And it was wild. Like, I mean, some people might be like, that sounds cray, like they weren't really in the room, but it really felt like they were in the room. Like it really felt like some kind of like a worldly, like on another plane kind of experience.
That's powerful. And I like how you said, it is just like allowing yourself to explore that and feeling into what is standing in my way, what stories are holding me back, and like really going deeper so you can release some of those things. And I mean, because I personally believe that, like you're a big fan of the sacred sexuality as well as I am, because I truly feel like it's a gift that was given to us. God, to be able to enjoy connecting, like this divine gift. And like you get to these points where, at least for me, I really do feel that connection. And if there's one thing you would point out about sacredness and around sexuality, what do you really enjoy about, what do you do, let's say, to kind of create that container for sacredness in your sexuality?
Yeah. Well, I really like to set a lot of intentions and space holders. Like I enter into my self-pleasuring practices like the same way I enter into meditation or I enter into any other spiritual practice. Like it's like, oh, I'm going to go do my practice. And it's very much about like honoring myself and like honoring the world and creating healing worldwide. So intention is definitely like one big aspect of it, and just always entering into self-pleasuring from that perspective of like, I'm going to go do a spiritual practice, basically. Like I'm going to go meet myself, meet the divine, meet the universe on other levels. Another aspect that's super powerful for me is nature. And I've always, even as a child, like I've always felt like the divine in nature. And so I don't fully even know how to articulate it, but there's just this connection with the earth and with nature around me that I see also as like sexual. And I mean, the earth it's like this constant regenerating machine. I mean, it's not a machine, that's a kind of a yuck word, but like, it's never ending. Like I believe the earth will far outlive all of us. People talk about us destroying the earth, and I think we're going to destroy ourselves long before the earth actually gets destroyed. Like she'll just keep going, she'll keep regenerating, she'll keep creating. And so there's something very connective about being in nature with my sexual energy and how that connects me to something greater, like to the goddess, to the mother, like to Pachamama, to like all of these plant energies, these plant medicines that are just like swimming with us, that I feel like we're very, in modern culture, we're very unaware of, very unattached to. Like we don't recognize like the constant energy that is existing around us. And so a part of like my sacred sexuality is connecting my sexual energy to that energy of the universe, and to the plant's energy, and to the earth's energy.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful to share. So, bringing in that intention. And by the way, I just want to say, like, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. If we don't get a chance to answer them now, we'll go back in the comments and make sure to answer them later. So do feel free to ask questions. And one of the last things I want to ask you, because I love asking your vision, like what would be your ideal vision to see people with regards to their sexuality?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, my vision would be for everyone to truly celebrate their sexuality, and truly see it as this like beautiful and deep and extremely profound expression of who they are in the world, and to see it as this like sacred expression of themselves, and that a sacred expression can come in so many different varieties. Like I think people maybe from like Christian tradition think of sacred as like but like it can be wild, it can be rage, it can be ecstatic, it can just be like profoundly pleasurable. All of it is sacred, and like what makes it sacred is that it's that truth, that like deep truth being expressed from our core, like from our original essence. So yeah, I think for me it would just be that everyone can truly tap into that sensation and feel it and know it and be it in the world. And I think it would radically shift so many different things in this planet that we live on.
Yeah, I love that. Let's all celebrate it and like beautiful.
Yeah.
Yay! Well, I'm so excited that I got to chat with you today. I feel like we could talk forever about this, but can you share with everyone where they can find you? They'd like to connect with you.
Yeah, for sure. So on Facebook, I have a Facebook group or a Facebook page called The Sacred and the Sexy. And that's also my Instagram handle, The Sacred and the Sexy, all one word. Yeah, there you go. And you can also follow me on Facebook. Rachel Halder is my name, maybe Rachel Ray Halder. And I post a lot of public posts on Facebook. So you can go on there and follow me that way. And I don't have a website yet. I'm in the process of figuring that one out. But yeah, those are the best ways to kind of stay up to date. And Instagram is definitely, I feel like, where a lot of people sort of hone in. But Facebook too, there's active conversation. But Instagram, it seems like that's where people are messaging me, and really like there's a lot of conversation happening.
Beautiful. I love your Instagram.
Oh,
So
thanks.
yes, follow Rachel. She's amazing. And thank you so much for being here. I
Yeah,
enjoyed talking with you.
yeah, it was super great. It was really, it was beautiful to like go into these topics and really feel into them and express them.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And
Yeah.
have a great rest of your day, everyone. Next week, we'll be actually talking with Rachel Sizemore of the podcast Ripen on awakening your desire. So, Rachel, thank you so much for being here. Again, you can find her at The Sacred and the Sexy on Instagram. And please, if you have friends that you think could benefit from this message, please share this video. I actually will also post it on YouTube. So you can share these messages and have an awesome day.
Beautiful. Thank you, Amanda. Mwah.